And with that, we'll welcome our next presenters, Cari Didion of Governor State University and Michel Nguessan, also of Governor State University. They'll present their paper, Onomastic Conflicts in Maritime Spaces, Gulf of Mexico or America, and Other Naming Battles. Professor Michel Nguessan is Associate Professor of Library and Information Science at Governor State University in Illinois. He has an academic background and research interest in linguistics and onomastics, software engineering and computer science, library and information science, and port maritime management. He graduated from universities in Cote d'Ivoire, the USA, and Canada. Professor Cari Didion is the Associate Professor of Library and Information Science at Governor State University in Illinois. She has an academic background in science education, library and information science, and higher education leadership. She holds master's degrees from the University of Georgia and San Jose State University and is currently pursuing a doctorate in interdisciplinary leadership studies. So I know you have your presentation, which is already on the screen. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you for having us again. My co-conspirator in crime here, Dr. Nguessan, we've presented at this conference, and we're very happy to be back and thankful for the opportunity. We're presenting our research on onomastic conflicts in maritime spaces, which kind of segues nicely from the previous presentation. And this means disputes over naming of seas, gulfs, and other bodies of water. Our project examines how naming practices intersect with international politics, law, and global governance. Our goal is to show that maritime names are not simply descriptive labels, but active instruments through which states express authority and legitimacy. All right, so let's begin with a question. What is actually at stake in calling a body of water the Gulf of Mexico rather than the Gulf of America? At first glance, it appears that this is a linguistic or semantic issue. However, maritime geography operates differently from everyday language. Names appear on maps, treaties, navigation charts, and legal submissions. Because of this, naming shapes how people interpret ownership, jurisdiction, and political legitimacy. A change in nomenclature can subtly reframe how a region is understood politically and historically. In this sense, naming is not neutral. It's a political act embedded with sovereignty claims and international recognition. So our core argument of this paper is that contested maritime names function as instruments of geopolitical strategy. Across multiple global cases, naming disputes operate simultaneously at these three levels: symbolic, expressing identity and historical narratives; legal, shaping arguments within international maritime law; geopolitical, signaling power and legitimacy to international audiences. Rather than viewing these disputes as trivial disagreements, we argue they should be understood as recurring mechanisms through which states negotiate sovereignty and influence. To analyze these disputes, the study combines three theoretical traditions. First is critical toponymy, a field within political geography that treats place naming as an exercise of symbolic power. Names help legitimize certain political narratives while marginalizing others. The second is international relations theory, which examines how states compete for recognition, legitimacy, and status in those global politics. And the third is international maritime law, or the law of the sea, particularly the framework created by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, often abbreviated as UNCLOS. The UNCLOS establishes rules governing maritime zones, but does not regulate the naming directly. Bringing these perspectives together allows us to see naming disputes as both discursive practices and legal positioning strategies. Why do these disputes arise so frequently? There are three main historical and institutional drivers. First, many maritime names originate in the colonial era cartography, when European powers imposed names that later became internationally standardized. The second is international organizations such as the International Hydrographic Organization, or the IHO, and the United Nations Group of Experts on Geographical Names, known as UNGEGN. They attempt to standardize naming, but rely on political consensus among states. When that consensus fails, disputes persist almost indefinitely. The third is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. They don't actually prescribe official names. This legal silence allows states to strategically deploy preferred terminology without violating any of the formal rules. Together, these conditions create an environment where naming becomes a low cost but high visibility political tool. Methodologically, this study uses a comparative case study design. We analyzed several prominent maritime naming disputes across different regions to identify patterns and variations. The research draws from international legal documents, institutional publications, government statements, digital mapping platforms, and scholarly literature. The goal is not to measure frequency quantitatively, but to understand how naming operates as political and legal practice across contexts. We offer several case studies. The first case is distinctive because it is recent and largely unilateral. In January of 2025, a United States executive order directed federal agencies to rename the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America, but did not create any international legal obligations. Other coastal states, particularly Mexico, rejected the change, arguing that shared maritime spaces cannot be renamed unilaterally. Digital mapping platforms, as we've noted domestically here, responded differently. Some adopted location-based labeling, meaning users in different countries see different names. This demonstrates a form of performative sovereignty where naming primarily signals domestic political identity rather than producing international legal change. All right, let's try moving on to our next case. Okay. Case 2 is the Persian Gulf versus the Arabian Gulf dispute, represents a long-standing regional rivalry. And you can see as the pictures are flipping, just the different names in the area. The term Persian Gulf has centuries of historical usage in international cartography. During the 20th century, Arab national movements promoted Arabian Gulf as an alternative, emphasizing Arab regional identity. Iran insists on exclusive use of Persian Gulf, while several Arab states promote the alternative designation. International organizations, including the International Hydrographic Organization and the United Nations Secretariat, continue to recognize Persian Gulf as the standard term. Here, naming functions as a symbolic proxy for broader geopolitical competition and regional leadership. The third case involves the Sea of Japan versus the East Sea. And this dispute is rooted primarily in historic memory. South Korea argues that the term Sea of Japan became dominant during Japanese colonial expansion and therefore reflects an unjust historical legacy. Japan maintains that the name is historically established and internationally recognized. Efforts within the International Hydrographic Organization to adopt dual naming have stalled due to disagreement. As a result, institutions sometimes adopt technical solutions, such as numeric identifiers, to avoid political decisions. This case illustrates how naming disputes can persist even when legal stakes are limited because identity and historical recognition remain quite powerful motivators. Our final case involves the South China Sea versus the West Philippine Sea. And this demonstrates the strongest legal dimension. The Philippines adopted the term West Philippine Sea for waters within its claimed exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, meaning the maritime zone extends up to 200 nautical miles from a coastal state under the UNCLOS. This renaming was closely tied to arbitration proceedings against China before the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. Here, naming functions as a legal and diplomatic strategy designed to reinforce jurisdictional claims and normalize them in international discourse. Unlike earlier cases, the name directly supports a legal argument rather than primarily expressing identity. All right, so there are four types of distinct maritime naming conflict: identity versus historical disputes, which focus on historical recognition. There's regional rivalry disputes, which reflect geopolitical competition. Then you have the legal strategic disputes, which are embedded in international law claims. And then finally, the unilateral performative disputes driven by domestic political signaling. This typology shows the naming disputes differ not simply in intensity, but also in that political function. The broader theoretical implication is that naming constitutes a form of symbolic power, meaning the ability to shape how reality is perceived and also understood. Maps and labels do not merely describe space, they help produce geopolitical meaning. Today, digital mapping platforms such as Google Maps and OpenStreetMap play an increasingly important role, effectively acting as informal arbitrators of naming authority. As a result, sovereignty is exercised not only through territory and military power, but also through language, cartography, and digital infrastructure. Our findings suggest several governance implications. First, maritime naming should be treated as a matter of global governance rather than a purely technical issue. Second, institutions should adopt differentiated responses depending on the type of dispute involved. And third, international organizations must engage digital platforms directly, since these companies now shape global naming practices more visibly than the traditional institutions. Without such engagement, naming authority will remain fragmented and inconsistent. All right, to conclude, why maritime names matter. Maritime naming disputes reveal that the language of maps is inseparable from the politics of sovereignty. Whether symbolic, historical, or legal, contested names shape diplomacy, public perception, and international legal argumentation. As maritime regions grow increasingly important for trade, energy, and security, conflicts over naming are likely to become more frequent and more visible. I thank you. I apologize again for the slides earlier. We look forward to your questions, and I'm going to turn it over to my maritime experts to help with some of those questions you might have for us. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Cari. I think you have done the job. I have nothing to add. What I want to say is that international law is not really law. It's soft power. There's no teeth in it. And it's based on consensus building. As long as people don't reach consensus, nations don't reach consensus, confusion will remain. And that's what we have in this situation. It's not like there is an authority above nations that can enact rules, regulations that can impose itself to nations. So as long as we don't have that international legal authority, because the organization has just soft power, we will remain with these kind of confusions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that presentation and the follow-up as well. This is it's all really interesting stuff, and you'll hear today too that during the name of the year vote, the Gulf of America was chosen as the place name of the year, sort of based on this sort of significance and the dialogue that was happening on a worldwide scale. Yes, so many interesting questions to raise here. We do have a couple in the chat, it looks like. The first one from David Wade, first became aware of the Persian versus Arabian Gulf controversy while teaching at Kuwait University in 1998 to 2000. Really interesting talk. The next one from Irina Martinenko. Dear Cari, thank you so much for this topic and for your presentation. So, what's your own attitude toward the perspective to rename the Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America?
Perspective. I think it was a performative move by, a political leader, and I will still refer to it as the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, and what I would say is that the presentation clearly indicated that it is an international governance issue. So a nation cannot decide on its own to change what should be based on international consensus, historical and international consensus. If the entire world agrees, or if there's an international organization that brings some kind of consensus, then it would be acceptable.
And then we have one more follow-up question. And can the name Gulf of America be already considered an endonym?
I would think so, because in practical terms.
Excellent. As you were, and Irina gives you thanks for your responses in the chat. Um, as I was listening to your presentation, I was reminded of a great article from a book called an edited volume called "Naming the Sacred" that actually I reviewed for names a few years ago. It's been a while now, but there's an article in there about the streets of Rome. It was a study of how these streets of Rome have they've been renamed over centuries. And it was only very recently, since about 1929, that we start to see all of these sort of papal names and predominantly Christian names of some of these roads. But there was an effort to apparently desacralize the names a couple hundred years ago. And so I kind of was wondering if maritime naming disputes similarly reflect these cycles of ideological assertions, where we see these rising powers that just try to remap maritime geography to reflect their ideologies. And if this is the case, are we witnessing, such a phase, not necessarily in, with the Gulf of America situation, but especially in Indo-Pacific maritime politics?
I think it's a cycle, and it's related to economic and political power. There was a time Spain and Portugal were dominating the world, and the names, international names of this kind of waters and seas reflected what they were doing. And then things change. And at this time, America is the power. And here you also need to take into the internal politics dimension. Maybe another American president may not feel the way President Trump's feel, and things may change. So it's a kind of fashion.
I see there is another question in the chat too from Professor Nick. Why is it a problem for there to be multiple names for the same location? This would seem to be the norm. Consider all of the different names that are given to the same location in different languages.
Okay, there's no problem with that. The problem is in international language, there should be a name. There is an article that I've just finished writing on a different topic, but kind of related. I wrote that about a continental river, the Nile River, starting somewhere in Rwanda and Tanzania and going all the way to the Delta in Egypt. Along the way, there are so many names because each group of people along the way, they see only their part of the river and they have a name. It has a significance, it has a cultural and religious significance. The colonial powers came and they named the whole thing the Nile. But people along the way don't know that. So there's no problem for them to use their different names. The problem is in international politics. So the claim that I make is that for onomastic sovereignty along the imposed international name, the other names for different segments in different countries, because in several countries along the way, Burundi, Rwanda, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Sudan, all the way up to Egypt. So there's no problem. The different segments should be recognized as such along the international name.
Excellent. Any other questions from the room on this paper?
Sorry, I'm probably going to out myself politically, so forgive me. But it would seem to me that the issue around the Gulf of America versus the Gulf of Mexico is not so much the renaming itself, because this often happens, but I think the controversy begins when a single individual begins to speak for an entire nation as if there is unanimity, as if one person's opinion counts for the entire nation. There wasn't a national poll in the US where all Americans were asked, hey, what about this name that we're using for this body of water? How do we feel about this? It was one person who basically said, I don't like it, and changed it, and then decreed that we all had to follow. So I think that it's not simply an issue of name change or consistency. I think it's also an issue of how. I mean, this is one of the most extreme examples in our history of top-down top-down change that is being done by a single individual. And then other people falling in line and saying, okay, well, if you say it, then we'll accept it.
Thank you very much, Iman. One more question from the chat from Rose Prince. I know that in aviation, confusion between similarly named runways or taxiways at the same airport or similarly named reporting points has caused accidents. I wonder if unclear naming could cause accidents in shipping or boating.
Okay, in navigation, international navigation in the maritime field, there is a need for precise naming because different vessels are moving around the world. We want to make sure that locations have just one name. So there's a lot of work going on in maritime circles to try to bring a kind of consensus on different names. So this kind of situation do not help. But what the good thing is that technology will point to a location, even when there is confusion about the name.
Right. Any final thoughts or questions? If not, thank you both for this fantastic paper. What a pleasure it was to have you at the conference again. And we're looking forward, of course, to your next collaboration, hopefully ANS 2027 next year.